Hello, and welcome to a conversation with Vasu Varadhan, held by Belong and Native Spaces. Belong is a social venture aiming to provide access to discrimination free services, specifically identity based discrimination free services on the basis of gender, sexuality, caste, race, class, disability, and so on. At the Belong Literature Collective, we do the same on the intersection of diversity and literature. And this event is being held with the help of our Library Network chapter, Native Spaces. Hi, Susan. And I would love for our listeners to know what Native Spaces is and what it does.
Hi. Thank you, Radhika, and hi to everyone that's logged in today. I'm Susan, and I run Native Spaces in Bombay with my partner Aditi. And up until now, Native Spaces has been a physical space, a bungalow in the suburbs of Bombay that's been our offices. It's a co-working space, and over the weekends, we like to host events, much like this, performances, and whatever we kind of liked. Keeping in mind the fact that we wanted to talk about Indian stories. This is our first virtual event, and very grateful to Belong for forcing us to get out of our otherwise pretty dead year. And I think with this event, what we've done is, for Native Spaces at least, it's expanded our definition, and we're now no longer just a physical space, but we've taken a native space across geographies and time zones, and we're still able to do what we wanted to do, which is talk about inherently Indian stories and what that means in against the context of being Indian today, which is also naturally a globalized definition. So thank you. I'm very excited to hear about the book and to hear from Vasu and Radhika.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you.
I would love to introduce Vasu Varadhan as well. Vasu is an Indian American author and academic at the Gallatin School of New York University, where she teaches South Asian studies and media. She has been previously published in the Hindu and the Indian Express. She holds a PhD in media studies and has taught a wide range of interdisciplinary seminars on media theory, identity in a multicultural world, ancient Indian literature, South Asian literature, with a special focus on emerging Indian writers in the diaspora. She is also the featured subject of the documentary Knowing Her Place by Indu Krishnan, which chronicles her struggle with cultural schizophrenia as an Indian American woman searching to forge her own identity. Vasu, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thinking and your thoughts with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to your team, to you, to Native Spaces for hosting this event and giving me an opportunity to share my story with an Indian audience. Although there are some of my friends logged in, but they've heard me read. Yeah. And this will be the first time I've given a reading in India. So I feel honored to do that.
And we're honored to have you as well.
Thank you.
I know that we have a reading plan, so I would love to dive into that. And if you have anything you'd like to say before that as well, I would be happy to hear it.
Not really. I mean, in the sense is that there are many stories about immigrants in this country. And I think it became very popular when Jhumpa Lahiri, interpreter of maladies, won the Pulitzer. Namesake, everyone that I know of, here, both Americans and Indian Americans loved the book, as I did, and subsequently the movie version of the book. And I did mention this, I think, to Radhika. I remember when I was trying to, pitch the idea of my book to New York agents. The standard reply, even from Indian agents, was, what else is there, what more is there to say about the immigrants? And, I kept stressing the fact that, yes, she is of a younger generation, of course, than I am, but as far as I know, but I don't want to make it, say that it's absolutely true because I really don't know, but having lived here for 56 years, I was surprised. One of the things that, let me back up, that I was trying to impress upon these agents is we don't have any stories, as far as I know, of immigrants who came to this country in the mid 1940s. And I'm one of those immigrants. And I feel even today that it's important to stress history in talking about stories. And that, along with social media and everything else, it's easy to sort of assume, as my students often do, that, problems, that we talk about today are brand new, that, oh, people really haven't addressed this before. And, I'll just say quickly, I teach a wide diversity of students. And when the Black Lives Matter protest happened this year, many people, including young Black students of mine, the younger generation, thought that this is sort of the first time this has happened. And they don't seem to understand the history of the civil rights movement, and even, what happened in Reconstruction after the Civil War, that, there has been an endemic racism in this country. So that's one of the reasons that I felt it was important to write my book, so that Indian, South Asian immigrants here, although that was not my the primary audience, could get a sense of what life would have been like, perhaps for their parents as well. Even though we were one of the, when I came to New York City in 1964 after I was married, when I was an undergraduate, I was, surprised. Well, I wouldn't say surprised, I was a chemistry major. And when my students hear my story, they go, "You, a chemistry major?" And I said, "Yes, me, a chemistry major." There were only 4 girls, or young women, I should say, in my classes in chemistry. And I was always referred to as, oh, that Indian girl with the sari and the red dot on her forehead, and referred to me in that way, never by my name. Anytime I heard, "Oh, you must be the Indian girl they're talking about." And, that actually stayed with me throughout my undergraduate career, because the NYU, where I got my degree, undergraduate, was not diverse at the time. Very few African-American students and practically no South Asian students. The only girl I befriended was from Pakistan. And we became fast friends despite the politics between our countries. I said, "We'll make up for it." And she was my steadfast friend for 4 years. And, it's a huge university with 40,000 undergraduate students. I just felt, and many of the, children of my son's generation, he's in his mid-40s, knew absolutely nothing about their parents' life. And in many ways, eschewed everything Indian, and never thought of themselves as Indian Americans, but as Americans. And that was another reason that I felt the book should be at least, read by that generation.
That's very true. And some of my questions for you also, circle around those topics. Before we get started with those, would you like to, give us a brief reading from your book, On My Own Terms?
Okay. Can you just tell me how much time I have? Because I may have picked more passages than can be accommodated.
Why don't we try to read for, I think, 8 minutes? 8 minutes would be good.
All right. If you can signal me, if you signal me halfway, then I can skip if I feel, oh, I'm not going to get to all of it.
All right.
Okay.
I'll do that.
All right. And another question, does the audience know a little bit about my background or nothing at all?
I think so. I mean, there should be some knowledge of it, and also everyone's heard your bio profile, and everyone who signed up for the event should hopefully have an idea of the book as well.
All right. I'm going to start, I came to this country when I was a 4-month-old baby. I was actually due on August 15th, 1947. And both of my parents were freedom fighters in the Quit India movement. And my father actually was jailed. They were ardent Gandhi followers. And I remember, everybody said, you're going to have, an Independence Day baby. And they already picked out a name, which is Swadandra Lakshmi, which is goddess of freedom. And I shouldn't say that, but I'm kind of glad that they didn't. And I was 10 days late. And my parents were a little disappointed that I didn't come out at an auspicious occasion. And therefore named me Vasundhara, which means beautiful earth. I'll just say quickly, my father was a journalist for The Hindu. He was the first war correspondent to have his own byline. He saw a lot of, carnage. The Japanese had invaded Burma, and my father was reporting from Burma. And just to give a little context, and then anyway, long story short, he had asked, the Hindu editor if he could cover the Independence Day, the signing of independence, and told the editor, if you don't give me the assignment, I'm going to quit. And there was another prominent family who had a lot of connections. And the editor didn't want to rile him, and therefore he gave the assignment to their son. So my father quit. And he, I'm trying to think, well, I can't remember the exact date of the famine in Bengal, 1940s. I suddenly forgot
I definitely think, I don't know the exact date either, but I know it was between 1943 and 1945.
Yes.
It was definitely before the end of the Second World War.
That's correct. Yeah. And my father went to Bengal to cover the famine. He was what you might call the first embedded journalist, or, they didn't use that term then. And he covered the famine. He actually lived the way the famine victims did. He ate, the lower castes were given gruel, watery gruel, and those who had money got, better type of food. In any case, he wrote about it, and the book, he wanted to publish it. And, that was in 1947, or I think, or 46, no, 47. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who Nehru's sister, read my father's book and toured. She actually toured. She heard about the book, and she toured Bengal to make sure my father was reporting accurately. And then when he didn't get the job, when he quit, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit told my father, since you are, a champion for humanitarian causes, there's this new organization, the United Nations. Why don't you go there? Because their goal, is to provide for world peace and hunger and, treat hunger, etc. And that's how he came to come here. And I guess he was very lonely without his family. And he asked my mother when to bring me, and I have an older brother. So that's how I came to be here. So, and we lived in the place in Queens, in Flushing, which is a suburb of New York, called Parkway Village. And Parkway Village was an international community. When the UN diplomats came here, nobody wanted to house them because there were, it was too diverse. People were afraid of foreigners in 1947. In 1945, actually, when the UN was founded. And then, the mayor of this place, Parkway of Queens, begged the residents to welcome these people. And that I think it was in Sussex County, Lake Sussex, they said, you will have your names on the map because you have opened up. And then they finally thought, oh, we'll get something out of this. And so they formed Parkway Village because that was further away. They didn't want them in their neighborhood, but they made an agreement that 300 apartments could be built for UN personnel. So I'm going to start there, Parkway. The process of adaptation was both painful and difficult for UN families, particularly for the South Indian Brahmin families like mine. Hailing as they did from a lineage of rigid orthodoxy, steeped in ritual, their very act of crossing the ocean was considered an act of pollution in the minds of the elders, a blight on the family name. Having committed this transgression, which was beyond atonement, it became all the more imperative that they preserve as many aspects of tradition as they possibly could. The onus of carrying this out fell squarely on the shoulders of the wives, while their husbands, preoccupied with more worldly matters, played a perfunctory role. Whether it be religion, food, or dress, there was nothing accessible in the immediate environment. No Hindu temples, no provision stores, and no sari shops. The rich diversity created by the UN in Parkway Village was a unique phenomenon for its time, but it was a self-contained diversity restricted to the perimeter of the surroundings. It was assumed that the needs of the community could be met from within. The tug of home and the fear that their heritage would be lost if the children became too Americanized bred a certain recalcitrance in many of these Brahmin mothers, including my own. As a necessary first step, they brooked no compromise when it came to food, dress, and ritual worship. Many homes became microcosms of an imagined India, mine being no different. So, I'm looking, all right, sorry. Okay. Parkway Village, crafted with artifice and the promise of a global utopia, lulled its inhabitants into a false sense of security. My parents were no exception. In this rarefied atmosphere and idyllic surroundings, a certain kind of myopia took hold, which blinded them to the injustices that lurked beyond the periphery of home. Little did my father realize that another type of conflict, mired in racist attitudes, would literally hit home. In this frame of mind, without giving it a second thought, my parents decided to enroll me in a local public school. It was a fateful decision, as it turned out. My childhood was scarred forever. I came to learn in real terms, more real than all the traditions of home, what it means to be an Indian girl in America. To recall those years in first and second grade at PS 117 in Queens is to excavate memories partially shrouded in a veil of amnesia. Sorry. When it came to the building that housed PS 117 and the faces of my teachers and classmates, my mind drew a blank. The only images that survived are the interior of the cafeteria with its long wooden tables and long wooden benches, and the schoolyard boxed in by gray barbed wire, and the schoolyard, sorry, boxed in gray barbed wire. I see myself sitting in a corner, a forlorn look on my face, clutching an unopened book, while a group of girls jump rope and another group play hopscotch. I hope against hope for an invitation to join in, only to hear the alarm bell signal that recess is over. I should have known better, given the contempt they held towards me. How could I have forgotten the daily taunts on the school bus where no one would sit next to me yelling, "Brown-faced monkey"? On a dare, a boy, and it was always a boy, would be exhorted by the others to spit on my skin to see if the color rubbed off. He was shocked that the color of my skin held fast and barely noticed my own shock as I hastily wiped away his slimy saliva with the sleeve of my coat. Lunchtime was a nightmare as they passed the cucumber cheese sandwiches packed by my mother around the table, taking turns to spit on it before returning it to me. I endured all of this with no complaint, not wanting to be called a tattletale, on top of all the other epithets hurled at me. I was not one to bring home tales out of school, and I seriously doubted if my parents would have listened anyway. I chose to suffer in silence that first year, until one day, well into my second year, I could take it no more. The nasty group of boys on the bus cornered me as I got off. I was pushed to the ground and stomped on. Someone tore at my green pom-poms of my brand new scarf-like hat, sending me into an uncontrollable rage. It was a present from my mother, and I had worn it for the first time that day. The way they clawed at it felt like a violation of her love for me. It was enough to bring me to my feet and fight back, making them flee. My knees all wobbly, I managed to make it home. I stumbled into the arms of my mother, who grew alarmed by my appearance. Cuts and bruises on my leg, my brand new scarf missing its pom-poms. I shed 2 abominable years of tears, repeating again and again how much I hated school. This time I kept nothing back. Every taunt, every contemptible act was described in detail. I'd rather be stupid the rest of my life than go back to that school, I cried, surprised at my own outburst. Learn to adjust, Vasu, my mother said, as she bandaged my knees. No violence, Vasu, just turn the other cheek, my father sagely advised, in a very Gandhi-like manner. Remember, he continued, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never harm you. Their tepid reaction infuriated me all the more and made me feel as if I had done something wrong. The next day, I begged to stay home, but my mother felt compelled to drag me along to the principal's office to get to the bottom of things. I was asked to sit outside. A little while later, my mother emerged with a look that was hard to read. Mrs. Axelrod feels you don't mix in with other children and that you prefer to sit by yourself with a book. She thinks you are maladjusted, she said, in a tone that sounded accusatory. I got the gist of the message without knowing what maladjusted meant, but continued to protest. No one wants to play with me. They won't let me in their games. The school year ended, and I remained an outcast. The only memories that have prevailed were the cruel ones. The rest has been sucked into a black hole of oblivion. The ugly countenance of racism had forced itself into our home like the snake in the Garden of Eden. It rattled my parents and assaulted their sensibilities. In India, their Brahmin pedigree denoted a higher status among all the other castes, a status that embodied characteristics of purity and virtue, which made them immune to the more pernicious traits assigned to the lower castes. To arrive in America and bear witness to the opprobrium heaped on their Brahmin daughter was unthinkable. They could tolerate being different, but they would not tolerate being inferior. As far as they knew, racism in America was reserved for Negroes. Indians were in another category altogether. Fearful that even dire consequences would follow, I was taken out of PS 17 and enrolled at the United Nations International School.
I think this would be a lovely point to start our discussion if you would like to finish with this passage.
Do you want me to read further, or this is enough? Or you just want to have a sort of a question after I read?
Yes, that would be great. Yeah.
No, how would you like to do it?
You can wrap up with the reading in the next couple minutes if that works for you.
Okay, then maybe what I will do. Well, maybe this will be an incentive to get the book, which would be nice. Let me see. Let me wrap up with, maybe I can wrap up with something a little amusing. Okay, where am I? 242. All right. In case the audience doesn't know, well, the pages are still sticking. I had an arranged marriage when I was 16. I didn't know much about anything. And so I was married on June 5th. And my mother's idea now of sex education, all right, it came to me because I absolutely knew nothing, all right. It was late. I got married on a Friday, and my husband's parents are ultra-Orthodox, and they felt that the marriage should be consummated on another day, exactly a week after I got married. And in a way, I was relieved because I was very tired. I had a 3-day wedding, extremely religious. So this is the Thursday before the Friday that I'm supposed to officially go to my husband's house. So this is my mom. It was late Thursday evening when Amma marched into my room and thrust what looked like a thick college textbook into my hand, saying, "Read this before tomorrow night and educate yourself." She then turned her back to me and abruptly left. The stark black cover, free of lettering, was as grim as the title etched along the spine. It read, "Ideal Marriage, Its Physiology and Technique," by T.H. Vandevelde, M.D. And as an aside, I still have the book. I don't need it, but I still have it.
Love that.
Huh?
I love that.
So it starts off saying, "Marriage is a science." How unromantic, I thought. The very word physiology reminded me of the aversion I had for biology, a subject I had never studied in school and opted out of when in college. To see it paired with the word anatomy in practically all the chapter headings, particularly the one entitled "Specific Anatomy and Physiology of Sex," did not forebode well. I jumped to the illustrations in the appendix and grew more petrified when I saw the schematic representations of the male and female genital organs each numerically labeled with its corresponding Latin name. Oh, darn, I said. All those years of Latin classes at the UN school failed me miserably as I tried to identify which of my private parts was a glans, clitoris, labia minora, or utheri, to name but a few. And then I'll just end with this, if you don't mind. Okay. All right. I tucked the wretched book under my pillow, a miserable substitute that contaminated the very spot where I hid Raghu's love letters. I dug out one of the more recent ones he had penned, with its outpouring of passionate phrases, urgent with desire. I savored each and every word. My dearest Vasu, he wrote, I will hug you, encircle you in a tight embrace, and kiss you full on the mouth until we forget everything. It will be an entirely new world where only we exist, where the only words in our language will be love, happiness, and pleasure. The book be damned. I was not going to let it deaden my anticipation. I was ready for a night of rapture, just as Raghu promised. So I thought I would end on a more humorous note.
Definitely, and it's I guess one of the parts in the book that I personally found really humorous as well, and sort of lightened the other perhaps harder and heavier parts as well.
Yeah.
And
maybe you don't, I mean, of course you don't know me that well, but I'm actually famed for my sense of humor. And one of my friends said to me, Vasu, this is so damn serious. Where's that humor in you? And then when I was writing that, it was one of the few times I actually laughed to myself. So anyway, I did want to end on a more, cheerful note.
yeah,
A note of promise, anyway.
yes, definitely. And I'm sorry to take the conversation then to a slightly heavier moment, but this is something we touched upon earlier while reading that passage, and also sort of contextualizing it with why you wanted to write a memoir and where that came from. And in the preface of the book, we discover the genesis of the memoir, which is in part due to the truly just distressing and sad moment, the death of your son Gopal during 9/11. And I personally was so sorry to read that, and experiencing that kind of personal loss with a background of sort of this a moment that's also very distressing and as politically charged and sort of defining for America, such as 9/11. How did you reconcile those two tragedies, and what did it mean for you to have personal loss come so close together with this national one?
Yes, that's a good question. First and foremost, I felt, apart from the shock, the grief, that you go through, I felt like my personal grief had been appropriated by the world, and particularly in the United States. That anytime anyone came to pay their condolences, well-meaning as those, that outpouring of love and care, it just, no one talked about my son. Some people didn't even know his name. And they would say, they talked about Al-Qaeda, George Bush going into Iraq and Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, all that. And I felt that some people just couldn't relate, on a personal level. It might have been too painful for them. I understand that. But for me as a mother, grieving mother, I found it very difficult to talk about my son as, one of the nearly 3,000 people who died, etc. Anyway, what I decided to do is, I got many suggestions from people. Why don't you write about 9/11 and the death of your child? And I said, I don't want to. And somehow in my heart of hearts, I felt that to capitalize on his death, to write a book, would be, at least for me, a grave injustice to his memory. And a couple of years went by. I went through some difficult times processing all of this. And in any case, I kept thinking to myself, I had come to India a few years later. I found it very difficult to come back to India and face, my relatives and everything, and have everybody come and mourn and cry. It was just too much. So I had gone to a temple in Srirangam in Trichy, where my grandparents lived. And, when I received the darshan there from, Lord Ranganatha, some voice was speaking to me. And believe you me, I'm not a very religious person. I am spiritual, but, I just never believed in those things. I usually pray for everybody's well-being. And when I received that darshan, some voice inside of me said, when you go back to New York, find something that is solely in your domain, that it doesn't have to do with being a wife, a mother, a teacher, all the myriad roles I've played in my life. And that voice kept telling me, why don't you find something that you've always been passionate about and either begin or return to it? And the same thing that kept coming up in my mind was writing. When I told, as you said, I wrote for the Hindu this, and I've always enjoyed writing, but I've always had, full-time jobs, and, I had two, husband, 2 children, and it was a difficult balancing act. And then I read something in the New York Times, in an op-ed column by David Brooks. And one of the things that he talked about is about, I think it's the artist Sting. I think it's Sting, found himself unable to create new music. And one of the things that he said was when he started thinking about his childhood and trying to recollect, he suddenly became very creative. And that it was a way, it was like, what I say, sort of recircling his childhood that allowed him to go forward. And that somehow resonated with me. And I was looking for strength and courage. And I kept thinking, what better, this would be a great opportunity for me in some ways to chronicle the struggles of my parents. And as I say, their story is my story, before I had my own story. But, I think, if the writing is good, I'm not saying mine is, but I'm just saying if the writing is good, I think the story should embed the stories of others. And so that's why I decided to write the memoir. You met Carol, who was my mentor, and supreme, editor, friend, and what I appreciate. I took her class. I just looked at a class, the title, Creative Nonfiction, and I said I have nothing to lose. I might as well try, and I loved it. I went in the first day. And again, the identification by others as, oh, that's the Indian woman with the sari who lost her son. We were one of the very few people at NYU, faculty members, who lost a child that day. And, I didn't want to be referred to that way anymore. Why should, the Indian woman with the sari? I mean, why not? And these were people in my apartment building where I have lived, I lived for 50 years, more than 50 years. So everybody knew me. And yes, I was one of the very few Indian women who did wear a sari. Most of my Indian friends, once they, emigrated here, they, cut their long hair, took off their sari, bindi. They didn't want to be identified so visibly. And, clothes are, give meaning to your identity. And, they often used to tell me, why are you still wearing a sari or bindi? You're never going to get a job out there. And I just said, I'm not giving it up, because I said, I was raised in two cultures. And I said, each part of those cultures matters to me. And since I did not grow up in India, I only grew, as a child, I was there only I came in 59 and left in 64. But those years were very crucial. Very different reception than what I got at Parkway Village and not in the public school. So while I was writing about my parents, the work my father did, my mother, already a fairly modern woman, coming to this country, she's a woman who never even wore shoes in her life. She couldn't stand stockings. Sometimes she'd go out in the snow with sandals. And my father would yell at her and say, you're going to get pneumonia, And in looking at how much my mother was able to grow in this country with her limited exposure, writing about her gave me strength. So as I was writing the memoir, the stronger I got to face, my sorrow.
Yeah, and quite a few things of what you just said, stood out to me as well about wanting to tell the stories of other people in your life as well, especially your parents, and also how that translated into your own perspective on what home meant to you. And,
Yes.
Your parents, as you explained, your father was a journalist and then went on to become a diplomat with the UN. And that also started the international chapter of their life, but also your own.
Yes.
How is their relationship to the idea of India as home? And, how were your perspectives different or similar when it came to straddling these two different cultures? And how did their perspective influence your own?
Well, I think of both of my parents, my father was perhaps a little more forward looking. He often stressed to me the need to continue to study, that I should, go on. I had a certain gift for languages, Latin, French at a very young age. And I was pretty fluent in French. And his dream for me was to become an interpreter at the UN. He was reluctant for me to get married young. He didn't believe in child marriages. He was absolutely against it. My mother, on the other hand, growing up in Queens, instilled everything Indian she could in me, from not ever being allowed to wear anything revealing, no, dress or skirts anyway above the knee. You could not expose. I mean, all my blouses were like up to here. And then when we went back to India, my mother, was dead set to make me as Indian as she possibly could. At that point, my father had passed away. He died 3 years after we moved back. And my dad was at that time stationed in Geneva. So, I was still, fairly young. I was 12. But my mother, as I said, she wanted me to shed, every ounce of Americanism in me. It was like, you shift to India, this is your home now. And I had not at all, as I said, I think in one of the answers, I could not assimilate totally. Number one, I didn't know the language very well. I mean, I spoke Tamil, but to this day, I can't read or write. English was my first language. And so trying to think of India as home was very difficult. As I think, as you aptly pointed out, my heart and soul was in America. But I really felt after, again, I enrolled in school. I went to Good Shepherd Convent in Madras. I also had that, if you can't fight them, join them attitude. And then I got rid of my American accent. It either disappeared on its own or I consciously got rid of my American accent. Number one, nobody understood anything I said in English because I had this nasal accent, and they would look at me in my, whatever. I didn't wear a sari, really, half sari, when I joined school. And they would say, looking at you and the way you talk, something doesn't sit right. They actually assumed I was very rich because nobody traveled abroad. I mean, my father, came here in 1945, and both of my parents come from middle-class families. And my father, had absolutely no luxuries. As soon as he started earning, he had to provide money to his father and mother and all his siblings because he was, the son in the family who had made it. So my friends were shocked to hear that I came by bus, that I brought my food in a tiffin carrier. And I have to say, by the time I matriculated from Good Shepherd Convent, I was as Indian as you could be. I embraced some of the, maybe superficial now, but the games, the dressing up, bangles, things like that. I, in fact, when I got married, didn't want to come here. I really had, the one thing, of course, I absolutely, I don't know, abhorred might be a too strong a word, was orthodoxy. I began to look at parts of Indian culture from a critical perspective. I went from, embracing, as I said, some of these superficial things to then see caste difference being played out, and gender in particular. I mean, one of the strong themes in my book is this gender inequality, that my brothers didn't have to go through that rigid orthodoxy. And I write about, when I got my period for the first time, the absolute, omission of boys in my life. Like even if my male cousins came over, my aunt, who raised me partially, would shoo me off into another room. Or she would say, I don't want you sitting down with them and playing carom board. So it was a very, very restricted childhood. And that was the part of being Indian I did not like. And I point that out in the book too. Because I had a mother who, her reason for getting me married so young is that she was a widow at 42. And I understood that afterwards. In fact, when I was writing the book, one of the most difficult things I had was to look at the past through the present. I felt like I had to keep my voice and my feelings in the past as it happened.
I really like that because I think there's something that's, from the book itself that I'm being reminded of right now is that you describe those feelings of being, of dichotomy, about being torn between your experiences as an American and also your experiences as a South Asian, as an Indian. And you describe that as the Russian Matryoshka nesting dolls, that
yes.
different selves encased, in its own shell. And, in some ways, this back and forth between India and America left you with an experience, very different from your parents in a way, because you say, and I quote here, I had returned to my motherland, but my heart and soul remained rooted in America. And this is when you had come back to India,
yes.
preteen almost.
Yes.
And, how did those various parts and versions of yourself work together? how did that, how did you make peace with the fact that your identity was in many ways divided or separated, across continents?
No, I have to say that um, I did not see any coming together of those identities.
Right.
For, I would say, the majority, I would say the major part of my life, I saw myself as two different people. When I went to India, I was not embraced. The only thing that they embraced about me was that I was not wearing mini skirts or pants or anything like that, and that I knew the customs, or it had been drilled into me. And even as I got older, when I went back to India, some conversation I had with my mom, and she had invited her friends over. I talked about feminism. This was the time of the women's movement in the United States with Betty Friedan and Jermaine Gear. It was that time, where people were talking about the rights of women. And I remember telling my mother, she would say to me, yeah, get a job, but make sure it doesn't interfere. Raghu, my husband's name, he has to, travel. He's a brilliant mathematician. You shouldn't stand in his way. The children are important. Like, she was shocked when she visited me in New York that I was taking courses and left the key of the apartment with the doorman. She said, you cannot have latchkey kids. What kind of a mother are you? And I was like, Mom, I'm studying for my PhD. It means a lot to me. Yeah, do something, but nothing too serious. And that contradiction, that my mother herself was pretty modern for someone who was born in 1919, to sort of deny that to me was a constant battle between us. So I didn't feel very, when I went back to India, I felt like a foreigner. Then when I came back to New York, despite the fact that it's such a diverse city, but at that time it wasn't that diverse, meaning South Asia, and the population is, I think it's over 2 million now. It was hardly anything like that in 1960s. This idea, as I said, of lopping off your hair and switching the sari, that didn't sit well with me. I could embrace, I think, what was American on the intellectual level. The opportunity I had, I only had the 1 year more than a high school degree when I married my husband. And in fact, one of the conditions my mother said, you educate her, because I told my mother I won't marry anybody unless I'm allowed to get a college degree. So she made Raghu promise and said, you should either educate my daughter or I'm going to take her back. And I'm looking at my mother saying, I really now have come to love this man. You're not taking me back. And she said, no, I'll educate her, Raghu, and then I'll send her to you. But he kept his word. He got me admission at NYU, and has been very supportive of my intellectual interests to this day. And then I think it was sometime in the late 1990s that this sort of, as I say, cultural schizophrenia was kind of tearing me apart inside. I didn't feel whole. I felt, that somehow two sides of me, just segregated, not integrated. And that took a long time for that to happen. It got to the point where, I felt that I could embrace both. That's what I refer to as acculturation, as I mentioned to you. Assimilation, in many ways, is leaving the past behind. Many immigrants do that. They change the accent. They don't want to be, identified even as coming from somewhere else. I don't. yes, I have an American accent because I've been here most of my life. But when I go to India, I can speak Tamil well. I can even crack jokes, which means I know the language. And I embrace our heritage. As I mentioned to you, for the last few years, I've been reading the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And then when I taught the ancient Indian literature course, although I had no recourse but to read translations in English, my husband even says, he was, born and raised, educated in Madras. He says, one time he said something and I said, I'll tell you why. And he's like looking at me, she's telling me why. And then one day I said, not to be mean, but I think I know more about the Upanishads and the Vedas and the laws of Manu. I've taught all those books. I've read them on my own. Radha Krishnan, the one, past president of India, the first president of India, his daughter was my mom's classmate. And I read all his volumes on Hindu philosophy. It was a chore, but a pleasant one. And it became important to me to know my own culture. And I think even to this day, some members of our audience will understand when you are educated in a convent school, I don't know if things have changed now. I didn't read a single Indian author, not one. I didn't even know there were Indians who wrote. That's how my education, I read nothing but Shakespeare and George Eliot, Jane Austen, all that stuff. But, I knew absolutely nothing. Like they would talk about Indian history and they would begin and say, we'll begin with British history.
Yes. And what you said earlier about your mother, throughout the book, the figure of your mother, really stood out to me, and especially so in separate, different occasions. During the courtship of your marriage, the discovery of the dowry that was, being demanded of your family. That was a moment that really shocked you, and it was something, that came to you as this really shocking discovery. And what stood out to me about that was your mother's seemingly sort of modern perspective on it, but then also her resignation and acceptance of it. And this is something that reflects in other behaviors as well. This conflict within your mother of traditional values, often subscribing to casteism and to internalized sexism, as many of the women of her generation would have done, but also often views and behavior that was far progressive when it came to women of her generation. And that's something that is something that we see now, as well as something that has to be confronted and challenged. And especially, coming from being a Tamil Brahmin meant back then and even now, privileges of upper caste. And part of the reason that immigration and a lot of the sort of privileges that come with being upper caste and upper class are that immigration was possible, and that sort of assimilation was more possible than perhaps somebody who wasn't from an upper caste. So, seeing that within your mother as well, how did you reconcile those differences within her? And I know in the book you describe meeting your grandfather and seeing those sort of behaviors within him as well, and that being troubling for you. I'm curious about your sort of thoughts on that, and also now today understanding the need for extensive anti-caste work, and also understanding what your unique position was in terms of both privileges, but also having, being a young girl, being a person of color in a country at a time where there weren't that many immigrants of color as well.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to the dowry, I mean, I was very shocked. In fact, up until that time, I had no outbursts with my mother, after moving back to India. Like I never questioned her. I just said, my mom will never do anything that's, not good for me. But, very, and this is not to condone what my mother did, but my father had just passed away 2 years, before I got married. And a fear took hold of my mother that everyone said, you're a young widow, you don't have a man to protect you, and you have a daughter who has come of age. The minute women start menstruating, even before, their marriages are arranged. My maternal grandmother, I think, was married at age 9. And I'm not exactly sure with my husband, maybe she was 12, but certainly, they all had to stop their education. And my grandmother was extremely intelligent, and so was my mother-in-law. She didn't study, I think, beyond 5th or 6th form or something, but she was an avid reader. She may not have been cosmopolitan. Raghu's parents never stepped out of India and never came to visit us, sadly. So we made it a point to go back once a year. In the case of the dowry, my mother's fear was that if she didn't provide a good dowry, then maybe the marriage would be called off. And my father, eschewed taking a dowry when he married my mother. So her father was more than happy. He said, I don't have to pay, dowry for, my mom. And my father said, I don't like jewelry, I don't like this. I will just marry your daughter because, I care for her. He would not have used the word love, but I think my father fell in love with my mom. And I think, partially my mother indulged in a dowry to satisfy all the relatives and the friends, because, people would look askance. You're not giving Vasu a dowry, so that part of the Brahmin caste issue came up there. And that's why I told her, I said, how, Appa was, and you're doing this. But my mother was, even because Raghu was here when we were engaged in New York, and there was still, quite a few months. I got married in June, and my mother was deathly afraid that my marriage would not occur. I think it was the fear of, my father was only 51 when he died. So it could have been that fear, which, because some responses to the book from, women in my age, from Italy and Eastern Europe, many of them said, you judge your mom so harshly. She was just trying to protect you. But I've never subscribed to that view. In the 56 years I've been married, and even before, I think, dowry is one of the more pernicious customs that we have. So I'm dead against it. And, I just don't, I think it's like selling a woman like a piece, of goods. I'm against that. So I think, again, that my mother, once she went back to India, decided to go back to India when my father died. He died in Geneva. She needed the support of her family. And she had friends who were very wealthy and really felt this was her opportunity to display wealth. And I was, and because I think I embraced more of my father's values, that I couldn't even have, the girls on one side come over because they were, Tamil Brahmin Ayers, and we're Tamil Brahmin Iyengars. And they were never allowed to enter the house. And I saw that as a child. And, the only explanation I got, they can't come in, they're Ayers. They said I could go to their house once in a way, only when their brother was not home. So these are, it seems to me that issues of caste play out in everyday life, whether it's the maid coming in to sweep, she can't come in through the main entrance, she has to go around the side, uh, not being allowed to buy any kind of street food because who knows. Um, and, one of the things, at least in Good Shepherd Convent, where all my friends didn't dwell on caste or even look. Like nobody would come up to me and say, "Oh, you're a Brahmin, It just, that wasn't what consumed us. And that I agree with you, that more work needs to be done. I think some progress has been made. And I know some Indian academics here working on caste. And in fact, I don't know, the recent book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste and Its Discontents. Her, a lot of people have criticized her fallacy of equating caste in terms of, racism towards blacks and caste in India, that she has somehow put the mantle of caste in India over the Black Lives, racism that's existed here even before BLM, and felt that scaffolding is rather weak.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of the book as well, and that makes sense. I'm going to move on to another book that I think is relevant to yours, and that is Meena Alexander's Fault Lines, and that is something that you mentioned as well as a book that you would recommend to South Asians, if
Yeah.
That's a book I personally love, and I find in terms of sort of the movement in geography, in the ideas of what migration means and does to identity, in all of those ways, the book is very similar to your own. And I was curious how you would characterize that influence, and also for you personally, aside from Meena's own poeticisms and understanding of what fractured identity, especially when it comes to migration and immigration, how would you define home and belonging? What do those concepts mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I read Meena Alexander's book many, many, many years ago, and it spoke to me because here was an academic, a poet, who had lived. She was sort of, I think, tri-continental, if I'm not mistaken, and she, her language attracted me right away. She has such a poetic and visceral way of writing. And what I also liked is, she talks about some of the beauty of being at home. Again, I think it evidences itself in things like food and all that. Food, clothing. Ritual, I think all of those things add to the feeling of home, which is why when my parents came, as I mentioned, read before, they had none of those cultural artifacts to say, I can go to the Hindu temple and I will see people there who look like me or practice or believe what I do. And a community forms. I mean, the Hindu temple, the first Hindu temple in the United States is the Ganesha temple in Flushing, not far from where I grew up. And, I feel at peace when I'm in there. I think that's important. And I think, it's also important to try to establish who you are when you do migrate. Like Meena Alexander did face a lot of conflicts, not that she didn't, but she was able to transcend that. And her book gave me hope I said, maybe I don't have to be a cultural schizophrenic. Maybe I can find a sense of self. And for me, it's always been academic. I have been able to, um, to establish myself through sheer hard work. I see that my time is well that you want to ask, but anyway, I'll just end with the fact that home now means both places. I'm really so heartbroken that because of the pandemic, that this will be the first time I have not made my annual trip to India since I don't know a long time. Let me just say I haven't counted the years. And I just said to my husband, I said, I miss, going home. And even to this day, even though I've lived here most of my life, whenever anybody says, what are you doing for winter break? I say, I'm going home.
Yeah, and I was an international student myself, and that's something I relate to very strongly, that feeling of having, missing home and seeing it, as a moving thing and a changing thing, and also looking forward to winter break so I can go home.
Yes.
And on that note, we have a question from the audience saying, could you tell us something about growing up in America that impacted you positively?
Is this before, as a child or as an adult or any?
Growing up, so I would think maybe your childhood, and that would be interesting to hear as well, considering.
Yes,
bullying.
I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I can answer, but what really made a huge impact on me was the United Nations International School. Yes, in some sense, it exoticized international students. You're the Indian girl. I mean, there were some others. One of my closest friends, has been a friend of mine since, God, I don't know, 47. I have to calculate, but certainly since 1950. And what I loved about the school were the camaraderie that developed amongst cultures that were vastly different and cultures that were quite similar. And those friendships lasted and continue for a lifetime. And I learned, what it meant to show compassion, to be able to enjoy your education. That influence has stayed with me to this day. When before we had an opportunity to get together, this is what we talk about. Do you remember this teacher? I mean, I couldn't remember a single person in PS 117. Not one. I don't even remember the classroom. I can name my teachers at the UN school. And I have to say, despite the, sort of created diversity in Parkway Village, it was the best place to grow up, despite some horrible things that had happened to me personally. But I couldn't have asked for a better environment. And that meant a lot to me. That is not to pigeonhole Americans as, they're vain or, they don't know enough about the rest of the world. No, they didn't. The Parkway Village gave an opportunity for us to know American culture, be invited for Thanksgiving, Christmas, we never did that. We did Christmas in my house for the gifts, but so yes, I would say that environment.
Yeah.
Gave me.
Yes, and Susan from Native Spaces has a question I think you partly answered earlier, but she's asking about, to a lot of young people in India, racism in America has come to light through the BLM movement and social media. And for those growing up in the 90s, the US has always been, perhaps incorrectly so, the gold standard of opportunity and equality. And I'm sure, through your own experience, having seen the US for many, many years sort of grow and change as well, do you see it as a sudden resurgence of racism, or is it more awareness of something that has always existed, or is it something else? And I'm sure your own personal experiences of racism growing up, as you said, not all your childhood memories growing up there were good. And there were moments that, in the book as well, you speak of being bullied and lots of really traumatic experiences for a young child, a young girl. So,
No, I mean, I'm not, I mean, when I look now, I think at, the way I've been perceived, as I said, there will always be, I think, implicit racism. When people say, I don't see race, I think they're, deluding themselves. We all see race. The question is, what can we do to minimize, false perceptions? Because, people meet me for the first time, even now, and they speak to me slowly under the assumption that I wear a sari and I don't know English. But at the same time, in New York, people will always stop me to get directions. And I keep thinking, why are you stopping me? And somebody once told me, it's because they feel immigrants will know exactly where everything is because it's a question of survival. So I'm not going to say that the racism, it's degrees of racism. And now what I find, Indians have been more accepted now because we're everywhere. And especially in a city like New York, you will meet, an Indian, every other person will be an Indian. Or South Asian, I'm just saying Indian, that's not entirely accurate. The second thing is that I'm heartened to see young people participate in the movement and that it's not just an adult only. I think that's extremely important. The other thing I think is the response, particularly to the Black Lives Matter movement, has now been to install a person of color in top positions. Yes, that's very nice, but you kind of wonder in institutions like the New York Times or the New Yorker, in fashion, Anna Wintour, Vogue. All of a sudden, if you take up the New York Times, ever since the Black Lives Matter protests, they have removed, heads of departments in the art world, and now everybody is crying racism. And I think what happens is racism and diversity get conflated. So, it's good to have diversity. I understand that. But now, even in universities, one university is saying that, you should hire a Black person to diversify, your department and not let them go, say, through the tenure process. Because they should be given easier access to tenure. So they don't have to do the review, the portfolio, stuff like that. I don't know whether, if you're a Black person, if you would even want to be treated that way. I mean, why would you say to yourself, oh my God, they gave me the job because they want to, diversify. So I don't think those measures are helpful at all.
There's definitely a degree of tokenism that we must be.
Yeah, I mean, even to this day, I don't know whether I got my job because I'm the first Indian woman in my school. I mean, it's at the back of my mind, but I don't give into it. I tell myself I have 4 degrees. My PhD is from NYU. I have a good record as a teacher. I have a good scholarly record. So why should I feel lesser than? And that's the danger of making, people of color constantly have to tell themselves, I'm worthy, I'm worthy.
Yes.
I don't think that's the way to go.
Yes, that's definitely very true. And speaking of your own personal career path, this is a question we got crowdsourced from before the event. And what were your interests in academia once you did move to the US and got into NYU? How you went from chemistry to South Asian studies and media and cultural studies. And on that note, also, we have a question from Terry M, who's asking, do you think mass media is helping put the flashlight on diversity?
Well, I wouldn't say mass media. I think more niche media. You certainly, most of the shows, during prime time on television are not about, certainly, I think the only show was with Aziz Ansari. He did something, what was it? Something one, suddenly. But after he was accused in the Me Too movement and everything, his show was taken off. And you will see more diversity in now, on streaming platforms like Netflix, Amazon, stuff like that. Amazon India, they have tons of programs that are beamed here from, what is it, Ever, Never If I Ever, and I was quite surprised, the raunchy, the sort of the sex and 4 more shots, please. Some of those things do an injustice, in my opinion, to movements to eliminate race. Some of the programs I find are sort of Indian women in Western clothing, and I don't think they provide. They don't enlarge the audience's understanding of diversity. So I wouldn't say I would go to the mass media. Documentaries, maybe more nonfiction type of programming. I would like to see more of that on a serious note, because now again, for Martin Luther King Day, they suddenly pull up all these programs that people perhaps never saw before, and I don't know if they'll see it now. So describing mass media, I don't have much faith in it as a vehicle for change.
Yeah,
I think, I'm a reader, very frankly. I think people should read more. Even if you don't agree with Isabel Wilkerson, her book is well worth a read. I think those things, I think people need to read books that deal with the historical connection between Indians and Blacks in Harlem. There's a lot out there. There's a whole website that deals with Black and Indian connections. So I think those are the kinds of things we should either develop more courses. This is my bias as an academic. I really think that when serious issues are couched in entertainment, it's entertainment.
Yeah, and I mean, I personally am a student of English literature, and I also definitely think there's a lot more that we can learn from constantly, reading and learning, and also a huge part of that is also unlearning and constantly being open to changing our opinions. And
exactly.
Yeah.
Very well put.
On that note, I think, thank you for this amazing session and for letting
Thanks, and thanks to everybody out there. Wish I could see you all.
Yes, and I fervently hope that you can, make another visit to India again very soon.
I hope so. Sadly, unless at least 75% is vaccinated.
Yeah.
Having lost 2 friends this week in a span, I have to say, you know, the reality and the deadliness of this virus hit home, you know, very deeply. So, you know, uh, when the time comes, you know, certainly it's home to both my husband and me, and my grandchildren want to come. And on a happy note, they're more interested in Indian culture. You know, my husband is the storyteller when it comes to that. So they say, "Tell us a story about Krishna," and what did Ganesha do? And my younger daughter, I have a granddaughter. You know, just on a upbeat note, her name is Stella. She's attempting to read my book. She's only 10, but she's reading parts. So she said to me, "No way am I getting married to somebody I don't know." So I said, "Well, Stella, whoever it is has to pass the potty test." I said, "Or grandma." I said, "You're not getting married." I felt like my mother. And I said, "Oh my God, they say daughters become like mothers." And I said, "Gee, that's not the part I want to be."
It comes full circle. Yeah.
But, thank you to Susan, right, from Native,
Space.
and to you, Radhika, and to Lathia, too. And to all the audience out there, please stay well. And I hope I get an opportunity that one of you will become a writer and I get a chance to hear someone out there. There is a writer. And do stay in touch.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Vasu.
Take care and do stay in touch. And I'm sorry Carol couldn't be here. And to my friends out there, they're here in New York, most of them. Lots of love to you. Thank you.